In a city gripped by tension, a violent police encounter sets off a chain of events that will change everything. When a respected community elder falls victim to police brutality, his son rises to challenge a system built on prejudice and corruption. And if you love your family and want to hear more incredible stories like this one, subscribe to our channel. The summer heat hung heavy over the streets of Oakwood, a predominantly black neighborhood on the city's east side. Officer Derek Hayes, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun, approached a group of young men gathered on a street corner. His steps were deliberate, his face a mask of barely contained contempt. "Hey, you boys got nothing better to do than loiter?" Hayes barked, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. The young men tensed, their expressions a mix of fear and resentment. "We're just talking, officer," one of them replied, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. "We live here," Hayes sneered, moving closer. "Sure you do. Empty your pockets now." The situation escalated quickly. Hayes's voice grew louder, his demands more aggressive. He shoved one of the young men against a nearby wall, ignoring their protests of innocence. From his modest home across the street, Greg Williams watched the scene unfold with growing alarm. At 65, Greg had seen his fair share of police interactions in the neighborhood. But something about this one set off warning bells in his mind. "I can't just stand by," Greg muttered to himself, setting down his coffee mug and heading for the door. His wife called after him, worry evident in her voice, but Greg was already stepping onto his porch. As Greg approached the group, he could hear Hayes's voice growing more belligerent. "I said spread 'em. You deaf as well as stupid?" "Officer," Greg called out, his voice calm but firm. "These are good kids. There's no need for this kind of treatment." Hayes whirled around, his face flushed with anger. "Stay out of this, old man. This doesn't concern you." Greg stood his ground, years of military service evident in his posture. "I'm just asking you to treat these young men with respect. They've done nothing wrong." "You questioning my authority?" Hayes snarled, taking a menacing step towards Greg. "I'm questioning your methods," Greg replied evenly. "This isn't right, and you know it." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the horrified onlookers. Hayes, his face contorted with rage, lashed out. His nightstick connected with Greg's temple with a sickening thud. Greg crumpled to the ground, his head striking the curb as he fell. Across town, in a bustling community center, Tyler Williams was in the middle of a meeting when his phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen, his heart dropping as he saw his mother's name. "Mom, what's wrong?" he answered, stepping out of the room. His mother's voice came through, choked with sobs. "Tyler, it's your father. There was an incident with the police. He's in the hospital. It's bad, baby. You need to come quickly." Tyler's world tilted on its axis. He mumbled something about being on his way and ended the call, his mind racing. As he rushed to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment everything would change. The hospital corridors seemed endless as Tyler raced towards the emergency department, his heart pounding in his chest. The antiseptic smell and harsh fluorescent lights only added to his growing sense of dread. As he rounded the corner, he saw his mother, Linda, slumped in a plastic chair, her face buried in her hands. "Mom!" Tyler called out, his voice cracking with emotion. Linda looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She stood on shaky legs as Tyler enveloped her in a tight embrace. "What happened?" Tyler asked, pulling back to search his mother's face for answers. Linda took a deep, shuddering breath. "Your father. He was trying to help some kids who were being harassed by a police officer. The officer, he hit him, Tyler. Your dad fell and hit his head on the curb. The doctors say..." She trailed off, unable to continue. Tyler felt a surge of anger and fear. "Is he going to be okay?" Linda shook her head helplessly. "They don't know. He's in a coma. They're running tests, but..." She broke down again, sobbing into Tyler's shoulder. As they waited for news, Tyler's mind wandered to memories of his childhood. He remembered his father's strong, calloused hands guiding him as he learned to ride a bike. He could almost hear his dad's deep, rumbling laugh as they shared jokes over Sunday dinner. One memory, in particular, stood out. Tyler was 10 years old, upset after a confrontation with a teacher who had treated him unfairly because of his race. Greg had sat him down, his eyes serious but kind. "Son," he'd said, "there will always be people who judge you for the color of your skin. But remember this, your dignity isn't something anyone can take from you. It's something you hold on to, no matter what." Tyler had taken those words to heart, carrying them with him through every challenge he'd faced. Now, as he sat in the sterile hospital waiting room, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "Mom," he said softly, "Dad always taught me to stand up for what's right. We can't let this go unanswered." Linda looked at him, worry creasing her brow. "What are you thinking, Tyler?" "I'm thinking it's time our community came together. We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the hours ticked by with no change in Greg's condition, Tyler's resolve strengthened. He began to formulate a plan, reaching out to contacts in the community, setting up meetings, and researching similar cases of police brutality. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Tyler had the beginnings of a movement. He'd created a social media page, drafted a press release, and scheduled a community meeting for that evening. As he looked at his father's still form in the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting him to various machines, Tyler made a silent promise. "I'll make you proud, Dad. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in, filling every available seat and spilling out into the hallway. Tyler stood at the front of the room, his heart racing, but his resolve firm. He scanned the faces before him, young and old, familiar and new, all united by a shared sense of grief and anger. "Thank you all for coming," Tyler began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "As many of you know, my father, Greg Williams, is lying in a hospital bed right now because he dared to stand up against police brutality in our neighborhood." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. Tyler held up his hand, calling for silence. "But this isn't just about my father. How many of us have experienced discrimination at the hands of those sworn to protect us?" Hands began to rise, slowly at first, then in greater numbers. Tyler nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "We're here tonight to say enough is enough. We're here to demand justice, not just for my father, but for every member of our community who has been mistreated, overlooked, or abused because of the color of their skin." As Tyler outlined his plans for peaceful protests, media outreach, and legal action, he was surprised by the outpouring of support. People stood up, sharing their own stories of discrimination and offering their skills and resources to the cause. One elderly woman, her voice quavering with emotion, recounted how she'd been wrongfully arrested while simply sitting on her own front porch. A young man described being repeatedly stopped and searched on his way to work, despite having no criminal record. As the meeting progressed, Tyler felt a growing sense of hope. He shared a story his father had told him about his time in the military, how he'd faced discrimination, but had also found allies in unexpected places. "My dad always said that change doesn't come from waiting for someone else to do the right thing," Tyler said. "It comes from standing up and demanding better, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The crowd nodded in agreement, their determination palpable. As the meeting drew to a close, plans were made for a peaceful march to the police station the following week. Volunteers signed up for various roles, from making signs to coordinating with local media. What Tyler didn't know was that word of the meeting had already reached Officer Derek Hayes. As the community dispersed, energized and united, Hayes sat in his patrol car across the street, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He picked up his radio, his voice tense. "Chief, we've got a problem. That Williams kid is stirring up trouble. We need to shut this down before it gets out of hand." As Tyler left the community center, buoyed by the support he'd received, he was unaware of the storm brewing. The battle lines were being drawn, and the coming days would test not only Tyler's resolve, but the very fabric of the community itself. The fluorescent lights flickered in the cramped conference room of the police station, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled officers. At the head of the table sat Chief Bronson, his brow furrowed as he listened to Officer Derek Hayes's agitated report. "Chief, this Williams kid is becoming a real problem," Hayes said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "He's got half the neighborhood riled up. If we don't do something soon, we're going to have a full-blown riot on our hands." Chief Bronson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you propose we do, Hayes? We can't exactly arrest the man for exercising his First Amendment rights." Hayes leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "We don't need to arrest him. We just need to discredit him. Make him look like a troublemaker, someone the community can't trust." The chief's eyes narrowed. "Watch yourself, Hayes. We're already under scrutiny because of what happened with the Williams Sr. We can't afford any more incidents." As the meeting adjourned, Hayes lingered behind, frustration etched on his face. He was so lost in thought that he barely noticed when Officer Martinez approached him. "Hayes," Martinez said, his voice low, "we need to talk, not here." Curious despite his irritation, Hayes followed Martinez to a quiet corner of the parking lot. Martinez glanced around nervously before speaking. "Look, I thought you should know. Internal Affairs is sniffing around. They're not just looking into the Williams incident. They're digging into everything. Excessive force complaints, racial profiling allegations, even some whispers about other activities." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying, Martinez?" "I'm saying watch your back. This Williams situation, it's bringing a lot of heat down on all of us. And some of the guys are starting to talk." As Martinez walked away, Hayes leaned against his patrol car, his mind racing. He thought about the years of cutting corners, the understanding he had with certain elements in the neighborhood, the complaints that had been swept under the rug. He'd always assumed his badge would protect him, but now... Hayes straightened up, his jaw set. No, he couldn't back down now. He'd come too far, done too much. If Tyler Williams wanted a war, then by God, he'd give him one. As Hayes drove home that night, the streets of the city seemed different somehow. Shadows lurked in every alley, accusation in every glance from a passing pedestrian. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. "I'm not going down without a fight," he muttered to himself. "I've given everything to this job, to this city. I'll be damned if I let some punk kid and his bleeding heart supporters take it all away." But even as he tried to bolster his resolve, a tiny voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. What if he'd gone too far this time? What if the walls really were closing in? Hayes shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. No, he couldn't afford to think like that. He had to stay strong, stay focused. The battle was just beginning, and he intended to win, no matter the cost. The law office of Sarah Jenkins was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in the streets. Clean lines, muted colors, and the soft hum of air conditioning created an atmosphere of calm efficiency. Tyler Williams sat across from Sarah, his posture tense, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Sarah leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp and focused. "Tyler, I want you to understand something before we go any further. What you're proposing, taking on the police department, it's not going to be easy. The system is designed to protect its own." Tyler nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I understand, Ms. Jenkins, but my father is lying in a hospital bed because he dared to stand up for what's right. I can't I won't let that stand. A ghost of a smile flickered across Sarah's face. Good. Now, let's talk strategy. We need evidence, Tyler. Witness statements, any video footage of the incident, medical reports. We need to build an ironclad case. For the next few hours, they pored over documents, made lists of potential witnesses, and discussed legal precedents. Sarah explained the intricacies of civil rights law, the challenges of overcoming qualified immunity, and the importance of public opinion in cases like these. The court of public opinion can be just as important as a court of law, Sarah explained. We need to keep the pressure on, keep this story in the news, but we have to be smart about it. One misstep, and they'll use it to discredit everything we're fighting for. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the office, Tyler's phone buzzed. It was a text from one of his community organizers. Got something you need to see. Video of the incident. It's bad. Tyler's heart raced as he showed the message to Sarah. She nodded grimly. This could be the break we need, but we need to verify its authenticity before we do anything with it. As they wrapped up their meeting, Sarah placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder. Tyler, I need you to understand something. This fight, it's going to get ugly. They're going to come after you, try to discredit you, maybe even threaten you. Are you sure you're ready for that? Tyler met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. I have to be. For my father, for my community. We've been silent for too long. Sarah nodded, a look of respect crossing her face. All right then, let's get to work. Over the next few days, Tyler and Sarah dug deeper into Officer Hayes' history. What they found was a pattern of behavior that sent chills down Tyler's spine. Multiple complaints of excessive force, all swept under the rug. Whispers of racial slurs and targeted harassment. And through it all, a system that seemed designed to protect Hayes and others like him. How is this possible? Tyler asked, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. How can someone with this kind of record still be on the force? Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. It's the blue wall of silence, Tyler. Officers protect their own. And those in power, well, sometimes it's easier to ignore a problem than to address it. As they built their case, Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that they were stirring up something much bigger than he had initially realized. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about a system that had failed his community for generations. With each new piece of evidence, each new witness statement, Tyler's resolve strengthened. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, possibly even dangerous. But as he thought of his father, still lying unconscious in the hospital, he knew he had no choice but to press on. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Tyler Williams was ready to see it through to the end. The soft beep of hospital monitors provided a steady rhythm to Tyler's thoughts as he sat by his father's bedside. The room was dim, the only light coming from the hallway and the various machines keeping Greg Williams alive. Tyler leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice low and intense. Dad, I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know something. I'm not going to let this stand. What happened to you? It's not right, and I'm going to fight it. Not just for you, but for our whole community. Tyler's voice cracked slightly, and he paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. I'm scared, Dad. I'm scared of what this fight might cost us. But you always taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy. That sometimes we have to stand up, even when we're afraid. As Tyler spoke, he couldn't help but think of the growing pressure he was facing. His mother, Linda, had cornered him earlier that day, her eyes filled with worry. Baby, I'm proud of what you're doing, she had say. Continuing from where we left off in topic 6, Baby, I'm proud of what you're doing, she had said, her voice wavering. But I'm scared. These people, they're powerful. What if they come after you? What if we lose you too? Tyler had hugged her tightly, trying to reassure her, even as his own doubts gnawed at him. Now, sitting in the quiet hospital room, those doubts seemed to grow louder. He thought about his job at the community center, the work he'd been doing to improve education and job opportunities in the neighborhood. Would all of that be at risk if he continued this fight? And what about his relationship with Aisha? They'd been talking about getting married, starting a family. How would this crusade for justice affect those plans? Tyler stood up, pacing the small room. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, Dad," he whispered. "But I know I have to try. You've always been my hero, and now it's my turn to be yours." Just then, Tyler's phone buzzed. It was a news alert. The video of his father's assault had been leaked online and was going viral. Tyler's heart raced as he watched the footage, seeing for the first time the brutality of the attack on his father. The video showed Officer Hayes approaching the group of young men aggressively. It captured Greg's calm intervention and Hayes's violent response. The sickening sound of the nightstick connecting with Greg's head was clear, as was the horrified reaction of the onlookers. Tyler's hands shook as he lowered the phone. This was it, the evidence they needed to bring Hayes to justice. But he knew it would also escalate the situation dramatically. The police department would be on the defensive, and Hayes, who knew how he would react? As if on cue, Tyler's phone rang again. It was Sarah, her voice urgent. "Tyler, have you seen the video? This changes everything. We need to move fast before they have a chance to spin this." Tyler looked at his father's still form, then out the window at the city beyond. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do this." As Tyler left the hospital, he felt as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice. Behind him lay the relative safety of his old life. Ahead, a storm of uncertainty and danger. But also, perhaps, the chance to create real change. He thought of all the people who had shared their stories of injustice at the community meeting. He thought of his father, who had never hesitated to stand up for what was right. And he thought of the future, a future where his community could live without fear of those sworn to protect them. With each step, Tyler's resolve strengthened. The video had changed the game, bringing their fight into the spotlight. Now, it was time to seize the moment, to push for the justice and change they had been denied for so long. As he drove home, Tyler began making calls, mobilizing his supporters. The next few days would be crucial. They needed to control the narrative, to make sure their voices were heard above the inevitable backlash. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and dangers. But as Tyler pulled into his driveway, he felt a sense of purpose that overshadowed his fear. This was his moment, his chance to make a difference. And he was ready to face whatever came next. The community center was packed to capacity, the air thick with tension and anticipation. People of all ages filled the room, their faces a mix of anger, hope, and determination. At the front, Tyler Williams stood, his presence commanding attention even as his heart raced with nervous energy. "Thank you all for coming," Tyler began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "By now, I'm sure you've all seen the video of what happened to my father. It's hard to watch, but it's also proof of what we've been saying all along. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a systemic problem, and it's time we addressed it head on." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tyler continued, outlining their plans for peaceful protests, media engagement, and legal action. As he spoke, he could see the crowd becoming more energized, more united in their purpose. "We're not just fighting for my father," Tyler said, his voice rising with emotion. "We're fighting for every person who's ever been mistreated, every voice that's been silenced. We're fighting for a future where our children can walk the streets without fear." As the meeting progressed, people came forward to share their own stories of police misconduct. Each tale added fuel to the fire of determination burning in the room. By the end of the night, they had a clear plan of action and a roster of volunteers ready to help in any way they could. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Derek Hayes sat in front of his TV, watching news coverage of the growing controversy. His face was a mask of barely contained rage as he listened to Tyler's impassioned speech calling for justice and accountability. "This is bullshit," Hayes muttered, reaching for his phone. He dialed a number, his voice tense when the other party answered. "We need to do something about this Williams kid. He's turning the whole damn city against us." The voice on the other end was calm, measured. "Easy, Hayes. We're handling it. Just keep your head down and let us do our job." But Hayes wasn't satisfied. As he hung up, his mind raced with possibilities. He couldn't let this uppity kid destroy everything he'd built. One way or another, he had to put a stop to this. The next morning, Tyler woke to find his face plastered across the front page of the local newspaper. The headline read, "Community Leader or Troublemaker? The Truth About Tyler Williams." The article was a thinly veiled attempt to discredit him, bringing up minor infractions from his youth and questioning his motives. Tyler's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from supporters and journalists alike. As he scrolled through them, one message made his blood run cold. It was from an unknown number. "Back off, or you'll end up like your old man." For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm him. But then Tyler thought of his father, still fighting for his life in the hospital. He thought of all the people counting on him, all the voices that had been silenced for too long. With renewed determination, Tyler got dressed and headed out. They had a protest planned for that afternoon, and he wasn't about to let a few threats stop him. As he arrived at the protest site, Tyler was amazed by the turnout. Hundreds of people had gathered, carrying signs and chanting for justice. The energy was electric, a palpable sense of change in the air. But as Tyler made his way to the front of the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Somewhere in the sea of faces he knew were those who wanted to see him fail, those who would stop at nothing to maintain the status quo. Yet, as he began to speak, his voice carrying over the crowd, Tyler felt his fear give way to a sense of purpose. This was bigger than him now. It was about his community, his city, and a future where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. The battle lines had been drawn, and Tyler Williams was ready to lead the charge. The courthouse loomed before Tyler, its imposing facade a stark reminder of the gravity of what lay ahead. He adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and climbed the steps, flanked by Sarah and a small group of supporters. Inside, the air was thick with tension. As Tyler made his way to the courtroom, he could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him. Some gazes were supportive, others hostile, but all were watching to see what would unfold in the coming days. Sarah leaned in close as they approached the courtroom doors. "Remember, Tyler, stay calm no matter what happens in there. We've prepared for this. Trust the process." Tyler nodded, squaring his shoulders as they entered the courtroom. The room was already buzzing with activity. Journalists scribbling furiously in notepads, lawyers huddled in whispered conversations, and a sea of spectators filling every available seat. As Tyler took his place, his eyes locked with Officer Hayes, sitting at the defense table. Hayes's face was a mask of cold defiance, but Tyler thought he detected a flicker of uncertainty in the officer's eyes. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. As the proceedings began, Tyler found himself transported back to the countless hours of preparation with Sarah. They had gone over every detail, anticipated every possible argument from the defense, but nothing could have fully prepared Tyler for the emotional toll of reliving that day through witness testimonies. Each account of his father's assault felt like a fresh wound, reopening the pain and anger he'd been struggling to contain. As the days wore on, the trial became a battle of narratives. The defense painted Hayes as a dedicated officer doing his job in a dangerous neighborhood. They tried to portray Greg as the aggressor and Tyler as an opportunist stirring up trouble for personal gain. But Sarah was relentless. With surgical precision, she dismantled the defense's arguments, presenting a mountain of evidence that painted a clear picture of Hayes' history of misconduct and the department's failure to address it. The turning point came on the fourth day of the trial. Sarah called to the stand Officer Martinez, Hayes' former partner. The courtroom held its breath as Martinez took the oath, his face a mixture of resolution and fear. "Officer Martinez," Sarah began, her voice calm but intense. "Can you tell the court about the events of May 15th, the day Mr. Williams was assaulted?" Martinez glanced at Hayes, then back at Sarah. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "What happened that day? It wasn't right. Officer Hayes, he went too far. It wasn't the first time, either." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Tyler leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe as Martinez continued. "There's been a culture of covering things up, of protecting our own no matter what. But what happened to Mr. Williams? I couldn't stay silent anymore. It's not what I signed up for when I became a cop." As Martinez's testimony unfolded, revealing years of misconduct and cover-ups, Tyler could see the impact it was having on the jury. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about a systemic failure, a betrayal of the very principles the police were meant to uphold. When court adjourned for the day, Tyler felt a mix of emotions: hope, vindication, but also a deep sadness for the broken system that had allowed this to happen. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. As Tyler emerged, a cheer went up. He saw faces from his neighborhood, people he'd grown up with, all there to show their support. But as he made his way through the crowd, Tyler caught sight of Hayes being escorted to a waiting car. The officer's face was ashen, his bravado replaced by a look of dawning realization. For the first time, Tyler allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be within reach. That night, as Tyler prepared for what would likely be the final day of the trial, he thought about everything that had led to this moment. The pain, the fear, the countless hours of work, but also the unity he'd seen in his community, the courage of people like Martinez, who were willing to stand up for what was right. Tomorrow would bring the closing arguments, and then it would be in the jury's hands. As Tyler lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he whispered a quiet prayer, not just for a favorable verdict, but for real, lasting change. The battle wasn't over yet, but Tyler Williams was ready to see it through to the end, whatever the outcome might be. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as both sides prepared to deliver their closing arguments. Tyler sat rigid in his seat, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Sarah gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before standing to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. "Over the past week, you've heard testimony and seen evidence that paints a disturbing picture, not just of one incident of police brutality, but of a systemic failure to protect and serve all members of our community equally." Sarah walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "This case is about more than just Officer Hayes and his actions on that fateful day. It's about accountability. It's about trust. It's about the very foundations of justice in our society." As Sarah continued, she methodically laid out their case, weaving together the testimonies and evidence into a compelling narrative of injustice and corruption. Tyler watched the jurors' faces, trying to gauge their reactions. Some nodded slightly, others maintained impassive expressions, but all seemed to be listening intently. "Greg Williams," Sarah said, her voice softening, "is a veteran who served this country with honor, a father who taught his son to stand up for what's right. And on the day he was assaulted, he was doing just that, standing up for his community, trying to de-escalate a tense situation. For that, he was brutally attacked and left fighting for his life. Sarah's voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. But Greg Williams' story doesn't end there. Because his son, Tyler, refused to let this injustice stand. And in doing so, he gave voice to countless others who have suffered similar abuses in silence. As Sarah concluded her argument, Tyler felt a surge of emotion. He thought of his father, still recovering in the hospital, and all the others who had shared their stories of mistreatment and discrimination. This moment wasn't just about him or his family anymore. It was about all of them. The defense lawyer then stood to deliver his closing argument. He tried to paint Hayes as a dedicated officer working in difficult circumstances, arguing that the incident with Greg Williams was a regrettable but isolated event blown out of proportion by media sensationalism and community agitators. But as Tyler listened, he could see that the defense's arguments rang hollow in light of the evidence and testimony presented over the past week. Officer Martinez's revelations about the culture of cover-ups and misconduct had been particularly damaging. When the closing arguments concluded, the judge gave instructions to the jury, and they were dismissed to begin their deliberations. As Tyler left the courtroom, he felt as if he were in a daze. The past week had been an emotional roller coaster, and now all they could do was wait. Outside, a crowd had gathered once again. News of the trial had spread, and people from all over the city had come to show their support. As Tyler emerged from the courthouse, a cheer went up. He saw faces from his neighborhood, fellow activists, and even some people he didn't recognize, all united in their call for justice. One elderly woman pushed her way through the crowd to grasp Tyler's hand. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "For years, we've been afraid to speak up, but you've given us hope." Tyler was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. As he made his way through the crowd, he caught sight of a group of young police officers watching from a distance. Their expressions were thoughtful, almost conflicted. Tyler wondered if perhaps this trial was causing some of them to question the system they were part of. As the day wore on with no word from the jury, the waiting became almost unbearable. Tyler paced the courthouse corridors, alternating between hope and fear. Sarah did her best to keep him calm, reminding him that complex cases often took time for juries to decide. Finally, as the sun was setting, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. Tyler's heart raced as he re-entered the courtroom, the gallery packed with tense, expectant faces. As the jury filed in, Tyler searched their expressions for any hint of their decision, but their faces revealed nothing. The judge called the court to order, and a hush fell over the room. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood, a folded piece of paper in his hand. "We have, Your Honor." Tyler held his breath, every fiber of his being focused on the next words to be spoken. In this moment, he felt the weight of his father's sacrifice, the hopes of his community, and the potential for real change hanging in the balance. The foreman began to read, and Tyler Williams prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that regardless of the outcome, the fight for justice and equality would continue. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman cleared his throat. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest, each beat seeming to echo in the hushed room. He felt Sarah's hand on his arm, a gesture of support and solidarity. "We, the jury," the foreman began, his voice steady, "find the defendant, Officer Derek Hayes, guilty of excessive use of force and violation of civil rights." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a burst of noise as people reacted to the verdict. Tyler sat stunned for a moment, the words slowly sinking in. They had won. After all the struggle, all the fear and doubt, justice had prevailed. He turned to Sarah, who was beaming despite her professional composure. "We did it," she whispered, squeezing his hand. As the judge called for order, Tyler's gaze found Hayes. The officer sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. For a moment, their eyes met, and Tyler saw something he didn't expect. A flicker of fear in the man who had seemed so untouchable just days ago. The judge's voice cut through the commotion. The court thanks the jury for their service. Sentencing will be scheduled for a later date. Officer Hayes will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. As Hayes was Liaz, Hayes was led away in handcuffs. The reality of the moment truly hit Tyler. This wasn't just a victory for his father or his family. It was a landmark moment for his community. A step towards accountability and justice that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. Outside the courthouse, the scene was electric. A sea of supporters erupted in cheers as Tyler emerged. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Tyler's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw tears of joy, expressions of relief, and a newfound hope shining in the eyes of people who had long felt powerless. Tyler stepped up to the microphones, taking a deep breath before addressing the crowd and the cameras. "Today we've witnessed more than just the conviction of one officer," he began, his voice strong and clear. "We've seen the power of a community united in the pursuit of justice. This verdict sends a message that no one is above the law, that every life has value, and that we will no longer tolerate a system that treats some citizens as less than others." He paused, thinking of his father. This fight began because one man, my father, had the courage to stand up for what's right. He taught me that change doesn't come from staying silent, but from speaking truth to power, no matter the cost. Today, we honor his courage and the courage of every person who has ever stood up against injustice. As Tyler continued his speech, outlining the work that still needed to be done to reform the police department and heal the community, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. This victory was just the beginning. Later that evening, Tyler made his way to the hospital. As he entered his father's room, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. Greg Williams was awake, sitting up in bed, a weak but unmistakable smile on his face. "Dad!" Tyler exclaimed, rushing to his father's side. "You're awake! When did this happen?" Greg's voice was hoarse but filled with pride. "Just a few hours ago, son. Your mother told me everything. I hear you've been busy." Tears welled up in Tyler's eyes as he grasped his father's hand. "We did it, Dad. Hayes was found guilty. Things are going to change now." Greg nodded slowly, his eyes shining. "I always knew you had it in you, Tyler. You've done more than just win a court case. You've given people hope." As father and son talked, catching up on the events of the past weeks, Tyler felt a profound sense of coming full circle. The nightmare that had begun with his father's assault was ending with a new beginning, not just for their family, but for the entire community. Over the next few months, the impact of the trial reverberated throughout the city. The police department underwent a major overhaul, with new training programs implemented and a citizen oversight committee established. Tyler found himself at the forefront of these changes, working tirelessly to ensure that the momentum for reform didn't fade. The case had also caught national attention, sparking conversations about police accountability and racial justice across the country. Tyler was invited to speak at conferences and rallies, sharing his story and inspiring others to take action in their own communities. But amidst all the activity and attention, Tyler never lost sight of what mattered most. He made sure to spend time with his father as he recovered, cherishing their conversations and the wisdom Greg continued to share. He remained deeply involved in his local community, working on education and job training programs to address the root causes of inequality. 1 year after the verdict, Tyler stood on the steps of the community center, preparing to unveil a new mural dedicated to social justice and community empowerment. As he looked out at the gathered crowd, he saw faces both familiar and new. There were young activists energized by recent events, longtime community leaders who had fought for change for decades, and even a few police officers who had embraced the push for reform. As Tyler cut the ribbon to unveil the mural, He felt a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. The fight for justice was far from over, but they had shown what was possible when a community stood united. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Tyler Williams was ready to face them, inspired by his father's courage and driven by the hope of a better future for all.